Hello and welcome to episode 7 of this Tiny Barn build series. Now in the last episode, I managed to avert near disaster of thousands of dollars worth of concrete hurtling down the hill, having broken through that formwork. I've managed to recover from that and I'm ready now to start the next phase of the build, which was going to be all of the preparations needed to get the concrete pad formed. However, there's been a change of plan. Have a look at these behind me. I've managed to acquire thousands and thousands of these cobblestones, or to be more technically accurate, set stones. I'm going to be using these instead, which I think is going to look just perfect. So it does change the plan for today.
I need to get some formwork in place so I can cast a beam around the perimeter of the retaining wall. But first I'm going to attempt to remove these wooden pipework forms I put in during the last video. And hopefully they work according to plan and come out quite easily. Now, because the forms had moved during the concrete pour, it did mean that a concrete skin had formed over the polystyrene, which was designed to isolate this plywood from the concrete, making it easier to get out. However, after chipping away at that for a while, you can see the plywood did start to move.
Gotcha. Nice.
And it was a similar story for the huge timber wedge I made for the drainage pipe coming through the wall. Again, a concrete skin needed to be broken through so I could expose that timber wedge and see if my design idea actually worked. Well, it was very reassuring to see how easily that wedge broke free, and once it did, I knew that this was going to work. And a little bit of persuasion from the hammer, and then later the pickaxe, managed to get the rest of that timber formwork out.
Hey!
I also needed to take the time to uncover another conduit. Now, if you remember in a previous video, I installed this one to accept the electrical supply and the gas pipe. And it was buried in the footings for the retaining wall. Now, unfortunately, the shutter also moved, unbeknownst to me, and caused concrete to seep inside the pipe. So I spent some time chiseling, drilling, trying to find out just how deep into this pipe this concrete goes. Now, if it's much further than, say, 5, 6, 7 inches, there's no chance I'm going to get it out, and I'll have to abandon the pipe. And that would be a bit of a disaster. Fortunately, after 10-15 minutes of messing about with the drill, I could see daylight, and so I knew all was not lost. Now, I took the gamble here of using the pry bar to try and push the concrete through the pipe and out the other end. It's quite a long piece of pipe. However, it's the only way I can actually get it out. There's the possibility it could have got stuck halfway, but fortunately, it didn't, and it popped right out. That's quite the piece of concrete. Now, I know what I'm supposed to be doing is starting to put the formwork in place so I can cast this beam around the perimeter of the retaining wall. However, seeing as I'm messing around with the conduit, it seems appropriate to finish off digging the trenches, and that way, once the beam, and more importantly, the hearth to the chimney breast has been poured, I can get the gas fitter in and get this pipe put underground. Now, I purposely left the rebar long so I could bend it over and tie it into the reinforcement for the concrete pad. However, since there's been a change of plan and now I'm using these cobbled sets, I don't need them to be this long anymore. I had this bright idea that bending them over and joining them to each other would be a really good idea, and sure enough it worked. But honestly, it was a waste of time and it looked a mess. I didn't like it. Cutting these off and having a horizontal bar tied to them, I think would have been much nicer and much neater. And so that's what I did around the remainder of the perimeter. So it's just a case of bending up the rebar, using as long a pieces as I can, and preparing it for tying in place.
Well, if you've watched a few of my previous videos, you'll know that I've been tying together the rebar using the little whirligig tool. And that's fine, it does the job. But check this out. I've just managed to pick this up locally off an auction website, hardly used, a rebar tying machine. So I'm very pleased to try this out and see just how much time this is going to save me. Now, these are fantastic little tools. They seem to work in a very similar way to a MIG welder in that they have a spool of wire that is fed through a power feed out to the tip or nozzle. And in this case, the nozzle is going to be tying the knots. It's magic.
It's brilliant.
It's fantastic. Measuring up for the final corner. So what we're looking for is about 1500 plus. And here we need to run right through.
With that in place, I can chop off these unnecessary extensions. Now I'm cutting through with a metal cutting disc 1mm thick, and I'm only cutting through around about 2/3 of the diameter. And that way the offcuts don't fall in down behind the wall, and the disc lasts that little bit longer. These bars can be bent over to form part of the reinforcement for the hearth for the fireplace which I'm casting up above, and I'm being careful here to make sure that the bend radius is particularly large. A tight radius isn't good for the steel, it can cause metal fatigue, and I don't want that to be an issue here.
Oh, it's perfect. Now these three pieces of rebar here, they need to be extended in length because they're going to be forming parts of the sides of the chimney breast which I'm going to be casting up above. And I've got these pieces of bar here cut to length, and you'll notice that here I've bent them with a small dog leg or crank. Now that is an important feature. I'm not entirely sure of the science behind this, but I could guess that there are two good reasons why that crank is needed. The first one is that it would bring this piece of rebar in line with this one, and that maintains all of your measurements and all of your accuracy. The second, perhaps more important reason, and again, this is just conjecture, I'm not entirely sure, is that because of the crank, it's going to be better at transferring force and pressure from this piece of bar into this one. I guess in simple terms, it's less likely to slide because of the crank. How good is that?
Now in the next video I will show you the design and details of this chimney breast feature. Now one of the reasons I haven't shared that yet is because I'm still working on it. I'm actually still tweaking the design and making adjustments until I'm happy with it. And I'm glad to say that I'm pretty much there now with the computer model. So I'll share that with you next video. Right now I need to get the steel reinforcement in place to be strong enough to support the concrete hearth, which will also become a roof structure for a display window. And to do that I've designed these stirrups.
Now I've got all of these parts made up to finish off the steel reinforcement for this slab, this floating slab, which is going to form the hearth for the fireplace above. But there's an issue, because all of these hoops and all of these stirrups have hooks on the end. I can't actually get them all in place. Let me show you. I've got one of these hoops installed, and I need this stirrup with the hoop on the end to go around this bar. But it's also around that bar on that end, and you just physically can't get it over there. I have to drop it on from above, but then of course all of these hoops are in the way. So what do you do? Well, I think I've come up with a plan, but I do need to remove these extensions that I've installed so that I can actually have much shorter bars to just drop these stirrups in place. And I think I can hook the loops onto these stirrups one at a time. I'm going to give it a go. Huh. Too easy. Now I'm not going to tie any of this together until all of the components are in there, because then I've got a bit of wiggle room. And the last couple of extensions and all the reinforcement is done. Now you can see on this side of the retaining wall just how uneven that top surface is, and this is the side that needs to be on an angle. Now it's roughly a 6-degree angle, but that's not important. What is important is that it's straight and at the correct height. So I'm just going to re-establish that by attaching this batten to the side of the wall and then pulling a string line through, so I've got something to align my formwork to. And with the line in place, I can see that the old retaining wall is now getting in the way. So I'm going to chop these posts down, get rid of a piece of this timber, so I can dig out a channel that's going to allow me to form the concrete beam all the way up to the area that's going to be covered by the cobbled sets. Now, usually I wouldn't support steel reinforcement by hammering bars into the ground. There's a potential for moisture to migrate into the reinforcement, causing it to corrode, but here it doesn't matter. This part of the concrete beam, or extension to the retaining wall, only has the purpose of supporting the weight of the cobbled sets, and it's temporary. In the future, when the landscaping is done, this will get buried and it will have no purpose beyond that. So I'm not concerned, I'm going for the quick, easy option here. With all the reinforcement in place, the next step is to put the formwork up. I need to put formwork on the inside and the outside of this wall because I'm no longer pouring a concrete pad. And so I've put together a quick sketch so I can make sure I get the heights right and I get the features in the right position. The hearth to the chimney breast needs to be supported so all the concrete doesn't run down and fill up this void. So I've used a spirit level to pull a line around, and that's where I'm going to attach my wooden framework. Now it's easier to make the framework and attach it to the concrete without the weight of the plywood in place, so I'm making the framework, attaching it to the concrete, then I'll go ahead and add the plywood sheeting. And it's attached using concrete screws. So I'm using a masonry bit to drill a hole into the concrete and then insert the screw, which will bite and cut its own thread. Perfect. Now, how many screws should I use to hold this in place, bearing in mind you've got the weight of that hearth, which is 250 millimeters thick, pressing down upon it? Well, the reality is, I think that 3 would be enough, because you can't break that piece of timber, it can only bow the plywood. But if this lets go, an almighty mess, a lot of extra work. So don't skimp, put 5 in. Now I want to make sure that this front is dead straight. And so the best way to do that is pull a string line from corner to corner. I'll measure where I want each of my pieces of timber to be. Then I know they'll be the right size, because they're all going to be very slightly different than each other because of the bowing of the original formwork when I poured the retaining wall. And here you can clearly see the situation. I've got the string line pulled from corner to corner, and it shows just how bowed this piece of timber is. 9mm or 3/8 of an inch in the centre here. So I've cut this to the correct length and fixed it in place. And now, when I put this screw in, it should pull it nice and straight. And keep going till it's perfectly lined up. And there we go. Nice. Check it this way. That's okay.
And I'm just going to add a couple more of these braces. That'll give me good support for the plywood sheet that I'm putting on top. Now the plywood isn't going to be one solid piece. And that's because I've only got offcuts. I'm just going to be using what I've got lying around. And speaking of offcuts, this is the pile of all the materials I've been reusing and recycling on this project, from the batterboards, the bracing and so on. And I'm continuing to denail and reuse this material. And in this instance, I want to use it for some vertical support to try and prop up the weight of that hearth, that solid concrete slab that's going to be poured onto this wooden frame. Now, it's 250mm thick, but perhaps more importantly, it's going to weigh over 500 kilos in wet concrete. Now that's a lot of weight, and so I want to make sure that I've done everything I can to prevent this from collapsing. Well, that's used up some more of my offcuts. Now this plywood won't actually move. The weight of the concrete will hold it in position. However, I am somewhat concerned that it might bow in the time between fitting it and getting the concrete in place. So I'm just holding it in place with a couple of screws. Now, if that last concrete pour taught me anything, it's that you can never have too much bracing. So I'm making absolutely certain that this formwork is not going to go anywhere when I pour the concrete.
Right, that's good enough for now. I'll put another one of these brace legs over here and one or two behind me as well.
You know, as I sit here working on this edit for this video, I'm very aware of how long this video is becoming. And I've not even started to pour concrete yet, and I'm at around about the 20-minute mark. So I really would like your opinion in your comments. What type of videos would you prefer me to continue to make? Do I continue to make quite long videos with lots and lots of detail in them, but several weeks in between, because of course it takes time to do the work? Or would you prefer to have shorter videos with more frequency? Now, I'm not talking here about reducing the amount of detail that I go into. I'm a details guy, and so I'm always going to cover all of these details. What I'm talking about is breaking up these tasks and processes into a series of shorter videos. What are your thoughts?
Now I'm taking no chances this time. I'm putting lots of these braces in, one every 450 millimeters. And that way I know that these forms aren't going to bow out.
So this formwork is 100 millimeters below finished ground level, and my cobble sets are roughly 50 to 75 millimeters in thickness. And they will sit on top of this concrete so that you won't see it when the project is finished. However, I am going to be installing some surface drainage, and I need a channel for that. I'm going to be using the cobble sets to create the channel, but I need to lower the concrete, so I've got the room in order to do that. So I'm just attaching this piece of timber into the formwork to create a step. And I'll have to do this at a couple of different locations around the perimeter. Due to the deformation of those forms in the previous video, the back of this wall really is not level. It's not in alignment, it's not where it needs to be. So I'm taking the opportunity to get this beam cast in exactly the right position. So I've set a pair of string lines showing exactly where the wall is supposed to be, and I'm going to set my forms to those lines.
Right, there's a whole lot of complication going on here because of my change of plan from a slab to cobbled sets and the fact that this wall isn't straight. So I'm trying to straighten things out right now by having my formwork lined with the string.
However, it needs to be 100 millimeters higher than the string to bring it in alignment with the front face of the formwork. So I just continue installing forms around the inside of the wall until the entire perimeter is formed.
Well, now all this formwork is in place, there's one more thing I need to do before I go ahead and put the bracing across the top edge. And that is to put some blocking along this back edge in 3 locations. And the purpose of that is to lower the concrete so that there's room for the cobbled sets. This is finished ground level. And so I'm recessing the concrete by 100 millimeters to give me room for the cobbles so I don't get to see this concrete beam when the job is finished. At the front edge here I do need to pour to finished ground level because it will be capped off with a brick on edge header course. And to know where to put that blocking, I'm referring to my sketch. I need to put it from the corner to the start of the column, and then from the edge of the column to the edge of the hearth, and then from the other side of the hearth all the way to the corner. You can see it perhaps more clearly in this drawing right here. Okay, just a few little finishing details to do before I can get this concrete mixed and poured, and one of those things is to put a floor or a base on the end of this beam. You can see how we transition from the rock here to the concrete retaining wall, and there's actually a gap in the middle. And that's by design. Eventually this retaining wall will return over to the cabin when all of this landscaping is completed. And at that point, this section of this beam becomes redundant. It is a temporary structure that's just going to support the cobble sets, giving them somewhere flat to rest. Eventually this beam will be buried on both sides and will have no function whatsoever. Now the other thing I wouldn't recommend if this were to be a long-lasting structural component is to support your rebar by hammering rebar into the rock as I have done here. Now it's perfectly acceptable in this location simply because this isn't going to be a long-term structural component, but I would be concerned moisture travelling from the ground into that rebar, rotting it out and ultimately migrating into the reinforcement of the concrete. And that would be a problem because as that steel rusts and corrodes, it's going to expand and that's going to potentially crack and blow apart the concrete. So this piece here needs to be around about 480 wide or wider. Yep, 480. And the gap itself, although the gap is only about 300 millimeters or a foot, I'm going to reach it right out to here. That'll give me good support. Let's make it 700. Well, summer has finally arrived. That just means I need to take a break every couple of hours and cool down. So I think I'll just sit here for a few minutes and watch this spider preparing his dinner. Now, because of some failings of the previous pour, there are some gaps in the formwork, as you can see here. Now, this is probably nearly 25 millimeters wide, about an inch, and clearly the concrete will run right through that hole and out the other side. Now, although there are several areas around the formwork like this is the worst. Now, on my previous video, Larry Wynn suggested perhaps using some of this expanding foam. So I'm going to give it a go, get it in this hole here. I've got a few just around on the hearth chimney breast there to do, and hopefully that holds. Now, they do recommend wetting the surface first. It'll help this foam to expand. I haven't done that. I'm just going to see how it copes with this rather sizable gap here. Now, although this feature will look like a chimney breast, it won't actually be one. It's going to be a housing for the gas bottles for the LPG system. So I need a gas supply pipe, and that pipe I've marked out needs to exit the concrete in this location vertically. But I've got to get it from underground way over there. Now, that means I need to punch through the front of this formwork with this conduit and have it exiting at this point. I also want to make sure that it's on an angle so it'll ease the transition of the pipe, less bends, and I don't want it to be in contact with the reinforcement bar. Oh, look at that, it's perfect. Well, now that expanding foam has gone off, just taking a blade to it to cut it back so that it doesn't impede onto the concrete. Then I can install this conduit for the gas pipe and support it with a timber framework. So the purpose of this column that we've formed in the retaining wall is to support the corner post of the tiny barn structure. But that's going to be a timber post, and I don't want to have that in contact with the ground or in contact with the wall. So I'm going to be embedding one of these brackets here in this corner. It's a stainless steel bracket. It's got a shoulder for the post to sit on, and then of course the two holes to be able to bolt it into position. The good thing about these brackets is they're invisible once they're installed. The only part you see is the part that protrudes from the ground to the underside of the post, but I have a plan on how to hide that. You'll notice at the end they're split and splayed so they get a really strong bite into the concrete. I've got my string line in place. I know that I need to be set 75 millimeters, 3 inches away from that string line, and I've got my center line of my post marked here as well. So I'm going to cut a few pieces of timber to spread across these braces, clamping onto this, and that way it'll hold it in place, so when the concrete goes in, it'll grab hold of it and hold it in position. Now it does pass through the concrete reinforcement bar down here, and I need to be careful that these two don't actually touch each other. The rebar is made of steel, this bracket is made of stainless steel. If the two are in contact, we could get galvanic corrosion, and I certainly don't want that to happen. So I'm going to make sure there's a space or gap or concrete in between the two components.
Oh, it doesn't fit.
I didn't think about that, did I?
Oh, never mind. Managed to get it in there. I'm just taking a few moments to mark out the centre lines so that if things move when I'm concreting, I can easily and quickly get them back into location.
Good.
And finally, all the formwork is ready to accept the concrete. Well, as much fun as it is building these forms, it seems such a shame to spend all this time and effort putting them in place, only to tear them down a few hours after the concrete pour. But they're done and ready to get a mix on. And I've also had a last-minute design decision to put some conduit inside the hearth here, and that way I've got the option of running some low-voltage lighting into the void below. And after spending a few moments with the leaf blower just removing all of the debris from the trench, I'm ready to mix the concrete. And I've decided to go back to mixing it by hand, so just delivering myself 1.5 cubic meters of mix ready to go.
Well, it's a beautiful day for concreting. Not quite the early doors start I was hoping for. 8:40 by the time I've got everything set up and ready to go. But I think we should get mixing and see if I can crack this off by lunchtime.
Although I'm fortunate enough to own 2 electrical extension cables, one of them has decided this morning not to work. So I have to keep swapping between the cement mixer and the concrete vibrator. Not a big drama, but it does mean I can't have a mix going whilst I'm setting the concrete. I waited until the next day to remove all the forms. I suppose after 4 or 5 hours I could have started to do it, but it was just too late. So, next day, I'm just cleaning up the screw holes and getting those forms off.
Here's a tip. When you're unscrewing a piece of wood from a concrete retaining wall and you're balanced about 1.8 meters above concrete ground, don't lean on the panel that you're removing, because if it gives way, I'm ending up in the hole. Oh, lost a screw.
This is a warning from the past.
incredible. The drone just landed itself because it got short of battery and I didn't realise. Now that's clever. Nice. Right, let's get this out. Ow! That's hard. God, says this. Do you know what? I think I've made myself a seat, but I'll bang my head. It won't look as good, so it's going to be a shop window. Let's get this out before I change my mind. Oops.
And just like that, the retaining wall is completed. Now, it's not the prettiest looking finish. I didn't take the time to trowel the surface and smooth the edges because all of this wall is going to be either hidden or rendered. But it feels good to have established the corner post for the tiny barn structure and get the hearth in place for the gas bottle fireplace.
Well, there we are. I think that turned out really nicely. I've got a hearth. Now what I need to do is build the fireplace that goes around it, do all of the services, the drainage, and then I can backfill this area and get a flat working space in order to put the building in place. Really looking forward to that. But that's it for today. So until next time, thanks so much for watching. Bye.